Barbara, you need to step aside and let me handle this. You clearly don't understand how a proper Thanksgiving should look. Victoria's voice cut through the steam rising from my turkey like a blade, each word calculated to wound. It was 4:38 p.m., the gravy still ticking on low heat. I marked the time the way librarians mark returns: precise, permanent. She stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen I'd cooked in for 37 years, pointing at my grandmother's china as if it were garage sale leftovers. The house deed lay forgotten on my bedroom dresser upstairs, yellowed with age but bearing my name in black ink. If only she knew, I thought, watching my daughter-in-law rearrange my holiday table with the confidence of someone who believed she owned everything she touched. Sometimes the most dangerous people are those who mistake your kindness for weakness. My name is Barbara. I'm 63. And until this moment, I'd thought my son Michael's marriage was the best thing that had ever happened to our family. I work as head librarian at Seabrook Public Library, organizing other people's stories while my own was being rewritten without my permission. The coastal November wind rattled the windows of my Cape Cod home, salt air mixing with turkey and sage to create what should have been the perfect Thanksgiving atmosphere. The salt wind slid under the door like an old friend. Instead, the holiday felt like a hostile takeover disguised as family dinner. Michael specifically asked me to coordinate everything this year, Victoria continued, her manicured nails drumming against my granite countertop. He said it was time for someone with proper entertaining experience to take charge. When did my son say that? The question burned in my mind, but I kept my voice steady. This is still my home, Victoria. I've been hosting Thanksgiving here since before you were born. Which is exactly the problem. She gestured dismissively at my carefully prepared side dishes. Look at this spread: canned cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes with marshmallows. It's so provincial. The smell of my mother's stuffing recipe filled the air, 3 generations of love baked into breadcrumbs and herbs. Victoria's nose wrinkled as if the aroma offended her sensibilities, and I felt something inside me shift. The most heartbreaking moments come when you realize the family you nurtured has turned into strangers wearing familiar faces. My recipes have fed this family for decades, Victoria. They're part of our tradition. Traditions evolve, Barbara. Michael and I prefer a more sophisticated approach to holiday entertaining. That's why I've taken the liberty of hiring a catering service. Hiring a catering service for my Thanksgiving, in my house. Using whose money? The questions multiplied in my mind as I watched Victoria check her gold watch with the satisfaction of someone delivering a perfectly timed blow. I wasn't angry. I was taking inventory. The sound of car. Doors slamming outside announced the arrival of extended family, and I realized Victoria had orchestrated this moment for maximum humiliation. Nothing hurts quite like being demoted in your own home while an audience assembles to witness your replacement. I think there's been a misunderstanding, I began, but Victoria's laugh cut me off like a door slamming shut. Oh, Barbara, there's no misunderstanding. Michael and I discussed this thoroughly. You're getting older, and entertaining is exhausting. We're just helping you transition into a more appropriate role. A more appropriate role. The phrase tasted bitter, like medicine designed to cure a disease I didn't know I had. As voices grew louder in my front yard, Michael's cousins arriving with their families, my sister pulling into the driveway, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of defending my place in my own kitchen, I would let Victoria expose exactly who she was. If that's how you feel, I said quietly, untying my apron with deliberate slowness, then you handle everything. I'll be curious to see how this unfolds. The look of triumph in Victoria's eyes was so complete, so satisfied, that I almost felt sorry for what was coming. Almost. But as I walked upstairs to retrieve the house deed from my dresser drawer, I wasn't feeling sorry for anyone. I was feeling something much more powerful. The quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly what cards they're holding. So why was I smiling as I heard Victoria ordering around my relatives in my own kitchen? The Seabrook Public Library, where I've worked for 41 years, sits 3 blocks from the harbor, close enough that I can smell salt water through my office window on windy days. Some people think librarians are quiet by nature, but the truth is, we're professional observers, trained to read between the lines and catalog information that others miss. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own story while someone else rewrites the chapters, you already understand why I kept documenting everything that came next. If that sentence found you, you already know why I kept the camera in my mind rolling and my mouth closed. My late husband David bought this house in 1985, back when Seabrook was just a fishing village that tourists drove through on their way to fancier destinations. We raised Michael here, painted every room twice, replaced the roof after Hurricane Bob, and planted the garden that still produces tomatoes every August. A house becomes a home through accumulated love, not instant ownership. David died 4 years ago of a sudden heart attack, leaving me with mortgage-free property, a modest pension, and the kind of loneliness that makes you grateful when your son brings his new wife home for holidays. Victoria arrived in Michael's life like fresh air through windows that had been closed too long. She was everything I'd hoped for in a daughter-in-law: educated, ambitious, and seemingly devoted to my son. Her psychology degree from Boston University impressed me, and her work at a high-end marketing firm suggested stability and success. "Mom, Victoria really wants to get to know you," Michael had said during their engagement. "She's excited about joining our family." Joining our family. The phrase had made me happy then, conjuring images of holiday traditions passed down, grandchildren learning family recipes, and a daughter-in-law who would care for Michael the way I'd always tried to care for him. The early signs were subtle enough to dismiss: Victoria's suggestions about updating my dated decor, her comments about Seabrook being quaint in a tone that made quaint sound like a polite word for pathetic, her habit of steering conversations away from David's memory as if my grief were an awkward social inconvenience. Patterns tell the truth long before people do. "You know what this town needs?" she'd said during her first visit, gazing out at the harbor where fishing boats had anchored for generations. "Development. A luxury resort could really put this place on the map." I'd assumed her ambition was generous, that she wanted to see Seabrook thrive. Now I wondered if she'd been surveying territory she planned to claim. Sometimes the people who promise to cherish your legacy are actually calculating its resale value. Michael's transformation had been gradual but undeniable. The son who used to call me twice a week now texted occasionally. The man who once brought me flowers on Mother's Day now sent gift cards because Victoria handled social obligations. The boy who used to help me with yard work now hired landscaping services and sent me the bill. "Victoria thinks you'd be happier in one of those nice senior communities," he'd mentioned casually last month. "Less maintenance, more social opportunities." Since when was Michael concerned about my social opportunities? I'd wondered, but hadn't voiced the question. At 63, I wasn't ready to be managed like an aging relative whose preferences no longer mattered. Standing in my bedroom now, holding the house deed that proved everything Victoria assumed was wrong, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard last week when Michael thought I was in the garden. "Once we get her settled somewhere more appropriate," Victoria had been saying into her phone, "we can really make this place something special. The location is perfect, and the lot size is exactly what we need. Make this place something special." As if 37 years of memories weren't special enough. As if the garden where David proposed wasn't special enough. As if the kitchen where I'd taught Michael to make pancakes wasn't special enough. The voices downstairs were getting louder, family members arriving to discover that Thanksgiving was being catered by strangers, while the hostess had been effectively exiled from her own celebration. I could hear Victoria explaining my transition to a more manageable role, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone delivering difficult but necessary news. Barbara's been struggling with the demands of entertaining, she was telling my sister. So Michael and I thought it would be better if we took over the hosting responsibilities. Struggling with the demands of entertaining. I'd hosted 42 Thanksgivings without incident, but apparently 1 year of marriage to my son had made Victoria an expert on my capabilities. The house deed felt warm in my hands, solid and legal and undeniably mine. David's signature next to mine, the notary seal still raised and official, the date marking the beginning of everything we'd built together. So why was Victoria so confident that she could redecorate my life without my permission? Last Mother's Day, he texted me a digital gift card. He used to hand me peonies from the yard, dirt still clinging to the stems. Progress, they call it. Distance is another word for it. Where exactly do you think I'm going to sit? My sister Helen's voice carried through the house with the authority of someone who'd been organizing family gatherings since we were teenagers. I heard it from my bedroom and knew immediately that Victoria's careful planning had encountered its first obstacle. "Oh, there's been a slight change to the seating arrangement," Victoria replied, her tone maintaining its practiced sweetness. "I thought it would be lovely if you and Barbara sat at the smaller table in the sunroom. More intimate conversation, you know." The smaller table in the sunroom. Also known as the card table, where I'd planned to set up a children's station if Michael and Victoria ever had kids. Instead, it was being repurposed as exile for the inconvenient older generation. The sound of Helen's silence was more devastating than any argument could have been. My sister had driven 3 hours from Portland with her famous apple pie, expecting to sit at the family table where she'd sat for 37 years, only to discover she'd been reassigned to what amounted to the children's table. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Helen said finally, her librarian voice matching my own in its careful neutrality. "This is Barbara's house. We sit where Barbara assigns us." Nothing reveals character quite like watching how people behave when they think they have permission to hurt someone. I listened from upstairs as Victoria's voice took on an edge. "Well, Barbara and I have worked out a new arrangement. I'm handling the hosting duties today, so the seating chart is my responsibility." "And where exactly is Barbara in this arrangement?" "She's taking a well-deserved break. Holiday entertaining can be overwhelming at her age." At my age, Victoria had never asked my age, but she'd apparently decided 63 was too old to competently set a table. The sound of more cars arriving created a symphony of slamming doors and excited voices, relatives unaware that they were walking into a carefully orchestrated coup. I recognized Michael's cousin Dave's laugh, Aunt Ruth's request for help with her casserole dish, and Uncle Frank's complaint about traffic on Route 1. From my bedroom window, I watched the chaos of a large family gathering, the kind of scene that should have filled me with anticipation and gratitude. China clicked, a polite applause for a show I didn't book. Instead, I felt like an anthropologist observing my own life from a distance, cataloging the moment when tradition died and replacement began. "Barbara!" Aunt Ruth's voice boomed from downstairs. "Where are you, honey? I brought your favorite green bean casserole." I heard Victoria intercept the greeting, her voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone delivering a medical update. "Barbara's feeling a bit overwhelmed today, so she's resting upstairs. I'm coordinating everything now." "Overwhelmed?" Uncle Frank's voice carried genuine confusion. "Barbara could organize Thanksgiving in her sleep. She's been doing it since before you were born." The house deed in my hands felt heavier with each defensive response Victoria offered. Each dismissal of my capabilities, each casual explanation of my declining ability to handle what I'd been handling successfully for decades. People's needs change as they get older, Victoria was explaining to someone, probably Dave's wife Lisa, based on the apologetic murmur that followed. Michael and I are just trying to help her transition gracefully. Transition gracefully. The phrase made it sound like I was dying instead of cooking. A knock on my bedroom door interrupted my eavesdropping. Mom? Michael's voice, uncertain and younger sounding than usual. Can I come in? It's your house too, I replied, testing the waters of his loyalty. He entered looking uncomfortable, like someone delivering news he didn't want to share. The 29-year-old man who'd called me his best friend throughout childhood now stood in my doorway, as if he were visiting a stranger. Victoria mentioned you were feeling tired, he began, his eyes not quite meeting mine. Maybe it would be better if you rested during dinner. I can bring you a plate later. Maybe it would be better if you rested during dinner. My son was suggesting I skip Thanksgiving dinner in my own home because his wife had decided I was too frail to participate in my own family gathering. Michael, I said carefully, do you think I'm incapable of hosting Thanksgiving? He looked genuinely conflicted, caught between his wife's narrative and 30 years of evidence to the contrary. It's not that you're incapable, Mom. Victoria just has experience with high-end entertaining. She thought it might be nice to take some pressure off you. High-end entertaining, as if Thanksgiving were a corporate event requiring professional credentials rather than a family dinner requiring love. When did you decide I needed pressure taken off me? I didn't decide anything. Victoria suggested that maybe it was time to let someone younger handle the big occasions. Someone younger. At 29, Victoria was young enough to be my daughter, but age had apparently qualified her to replace me in my own life. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, followed by Victoria's voice welcoming the catering service she'd hired without consulting anyone. The smell of unfamiliar food began mixing with my traditional recipes, creating an olfactory confusion that matched the emotional chaos of the day. The caterers are here, Michael said, as if this explained everything. Victoria arranged for professional service. It'll be really nice. Professional service, in place of the woman who'd been serving this family before he was born. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw someone who'd been convinced that love was outdated and efficiency was an improvement. Someone who'd been taught to see his mother's capabilities as limitations requiring professional intervention. Michael, I said quietly, when did you stop trusting me? Kindness is my nature. Silence is my strategy. So why did he look like someone who'd just realized he'd made a terrible mistake? The advantage of being a librarian is that you learn to research quietly, to gather information without drawing attention to yourself. People assume librarians are harmless, invisible even, which makes them excellent witnesses to behavior others might miss. From my bedroom window, I watched the catering truck unload expensive-looking chafing dishes, while Victoria directed the placement of each item with the authority of someone hosting her own event. The workers moved efficiently, transforming my kitchen into something that looked professionally elegant and completely impersonal. The most dangerous theft is the kind that makes you grateful for being robbed. My laptop sat open on my desk, and muscle memory guided my fingers to Facebook, the digital town square where modern families unknowingly document their own betrayals. Victoria's profile painted a picture I'd been too trusting to see clearly before. 3 weeks ago. So excited to be taking over holiday planning for the family. Time for some fresh energy and new traditions. Hostess life. Thanksgiving 2024. Taking over. Not helping, not collaborating. Taking over. 57 likes, including one from Michael. 2 weeks ago, looking at beautiful coastal properties with my amazing husband, dreams are becoming reality. Chakro, blessed life. Future home, Hakark, Seabrook views. Coastal properties. In a town where my house was one of only 12 properties with direct water views. The photo showed Michael and Victoria standing in front of my neighbor's house, which had been for sale since August. 1 week ago. Sometimes you have to help the people you love transition into the next phase of their lives. It's not always easy, but it's what family does. Family first. Tough love. Shaw, next chapter. Transition into the next phase of their lives. The clinical language made it sound like I was being moved to hospice care rather than being edged out of my own holiday table. The comments on this post revealed conversations I wasn't privy to. Sarah Chen. So mature of you to help her see what's best. My mother-in-law went through the same thing. Victoria. It's all about presenting options in a way that feels empowering rather than limiting. Psychology background helps. Nothing reveals someone's true intentions quite like watching how they talk about you when they think you're not listening. I screenshotted everything, a habit developed from 40 years of preserving fragile documents that might be damaged or lost. Victoria's digital trail painted a picture of someone who'd been planning my displacement with the methodical care of a campaign manager. Her social posts weren't about family, they were brand updates. Even her empathy came with a curated filter. A text message thread between Victoria and someone named Jess R. appeared in the preview of Victoria's latest post. Jess R. How's Operation Retirement Home going? Victoria. Perfectly. She practically exiled herself today. By Christmas, she'll be begging for assisted living. Jess R. You're evil. I love it. When do you move in officially? Victoria. Michael's handling the paperwork this week. Poor thing thinks he's helping his mom transition gracefully. Operation Retirement Home. My displacement had a code name and a timeline, complete with my son as an unwitting accomplice. The house deed lay next to my laptop, and I photographed it with the same methodical care I'd used to document Victoria's digital evidence. Legal proof of ownership, captured with metadata that would show today's date and time. Downstairs, the sounds of professional service continued. Caterers arranging food I hadn't chosen, Victoria directing placement of flowers I hadn't selected, my family gathering around a table set by strangers in my own home. Barbara? Helen's voice carried upstairs, concerned and persistent. Are you actually sick? Or is something else going on here? I opened my bedroom door enough to call down quietly. Come up here for a minute. I want to show you something. Helen's footsteps on the stairs were quick and determined. She entered my bedroom with the expression of someone prepared for battle, her grandmother's pearl necklace catching the afternoon light streaming through windows I'd cleaned just yesterday. What in God's name is happening down there? She demanded. Victoria has caterers rearranging your entire kitchen, and she told Uncle Frank that you're stepping back from entertaining because it's become too much for you. I handed her my laptop, open to Victoria's Facebook page. Helen's expression shifted from confusion to anger, to something deeper and more protective as she read through the documented evidence of planned displacement. She's been planning this for weeks, Helen said, scrolling through posts and comments. Look at these dates. She was announcing your retirement from hosting before she'd even discussed it with you. That's not the worst part. I showed her the text message previews, the casual cruelty of Operation Retirement Home, and Victoria's confidence that Michael would handle paperwork without understanding what he was signing. Helen's face went very still, the way it had when we were children and someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She's using Michael to push you out of your own house. And he doesn't realize it. The words hurt to speak, but they needed to be said. He thinks he's helping me transition to an easier life. The sound of laughter floated up from my dining room, where my family was apparently enjoying dinner I hadn't cooked, seated at a table I hadn't set, in a home where I'd been relegated to upstairs exile. Helen stood up with the decisive movement of someone who'd seen enough evidence. We're going downstairs. Not yet. I picked up the house deed, feeling its weight and authority. Let her finish what she started. Let everyone see exactly who Victoria really is before we show them who owns what. Some rescues begin with letting the performance continue. So why was the sound of professional success downstairs making me feel more confident instead of more defeated? Barbara, there you are! Aunt Ruth's voice boomed across my dining room as Helen and I descended the stairs, cutting through the polite murmur of catered conversation like a foghorn through coastal mist. The relief in her tone was unmistakable. She'd been worried about my unexplained absence from my own Thanksgiving dinner. The scene before me was surreal. My dining room transformed into something from a magazine spread, complete with professionally arranged centerpieces that had replaced the simple pine cone and berry display I'd made yesterday. Her perfume was winter sweet, the kind that tries to erase a kitchen's history. My family sat around my table, eating food from silver chafing dishes instead of the mismatched serving bowls that had been collecting family history for decades. I was beginning to think you'd been kidnapped, Uncle Frank declared, his voice carrying enough volume to pause all other conversations. Victoria said you were feeling overwhelmed, but you look fine to me. Victoria's smile remained perfectly in place, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested this wasn't going according to script. Barbara, I was just about to bring you a plate upstairs. The catered turkey is absolutely delicious. The catered turkey. In a room where my own turkey sat abandoned in the kitchen, perfectly cooked but apparently not sophisticated enough for the elevated gathering Victoria had orchestrated. Sometimes the most revealing moments come when someone's careful performance gets interrupted by unscripted reality. How thoughtful, I replied, taking my time to scan the room. Though I'm surprised to see caterers handling Thanksgiving. When did we decide our family recipes weren't good enough? The question hung in the air like smoke, creating exactly the kind of tension Victoria had been working to avoid. Several conversations stopped entirely as relatives processed the implications of professional catering, replacing traditional family cooking. Oh, it's not that the recipes weren't good enough, Victoria laughed, the sound slightly forced. I just thought it would be nice for you to enjoy Thanksgiving as a guest instead of working so hard as hostess. Enjoy Thanksgiving as a guest, in my own home, at my own table. During the holiday I'd been hosting since before Victoria was born, Dave's wife Lisa looked confused. But Barbara loves cooking for Thanksgiving. Remember last year when she made that incredible stuffing recipe that's been in your family for generations? People's energy levels change, Victoria replied smoothly, her psychology background evident in the gentle, therapeutic tone. Michael and I wanted to help Barbara transition to a more relaxing holiday experience. Helen cleared her throat with the sound of someone preparing to present evidence. Transition to what exactly? The directness of the question created a ripple of silence around the table. Victoria's practiced smile wavered slightly as she registered that Helen wasn't accepting the narrative of helpful accommodation that had satisfied everyone else. Well, to a phase where she can enjoy family time without the stress of preparation and hosting responsibilities, Victoria explained, her voice taking on the careful patience of someone talking to someone slow to understand. And who decided Barbara was feeling stressed? Helen continued, her librarian training evident in the methodical way she was building her cross-examination. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the head of the table, David's seat, where he'd been sitting since his father's death 4 years ago. Helen, Victoria's just trying to help. I'm asking Victoria to explain exactly how she determined that your mother needed help she didn't ask for. The room had gone completely quiet now, relatives sensing that this conversation had moved beyond holiday coordination into something more serious. Uncle Frank set down his fork with deliberate care, and Aunt Ruth's expression sharpened with protective alertness. I have a background in psychology, Victoria said, her voice taking on professional authority. I know the signs of someone struggling to admit they need assistance. Barbara's been showing classic indicators of overwhelm, forgetting details, seeming tired, having difficulty with complex planning, forgetting details, seeming tired, having difficulty with complex planning. Each phrase was a small knife, cutting away at my competence with clinical precision. What details has she forgotten? Helen asked immediately. Victoria hesitated for the first time, clearly unprepared for specific examples to support her general diagnosis. Well, little things. You know how it is. No, I don't know how it is. Give me an example. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to realize that Victoria couldn't provide examples because they didn't exist. Her psychological assessment of my declining capabilities was based on assumption rather than observation, projection rather than evidence. Helen, Michael said quietly, maybe we could discuss this privately. No. My voice carried clearly across my dining room, stopping my son's attempt to protect Victoria from the consequences of her public humiliation of me. Let's discuss this right here, with the family who's been eating catered food while my turkey sits in the kitchen because Victoria decided my cooking wasn't suitable for company. The house deed felt solid in my pocket, legal weight that gave substance to the authority I was about to reclaim. Victoria, I said calmly, I think it's time you explain to everyone exactly what kind of transition you've been planning for me. So why did she suddenly look like someone who'd realized she'd walked into a trap she'd set for someone else? I don't know what you're implying, Barbara. Victoria's voice had lost its therapeutic patience, replaced by the sharp edge of someone whose careful performance was being exposed. She gripped her wineglass like a shield, her knuckles white against the crystal. Show them your phone, I said quietly. Show them the Facebook posts about taking over holiday planning and helping me transition. Show them the text messages about Operation Retirement Home. The color drained from Victoria's face so quickly that several relatives leaned forward in concern. Michael looked genuinely confused, his expression shifting between his wife and his mother, as if watching a conversation in a language he didn't understand. Barbara, I think you misunderstood, Victoria began, but Helen was already placing my laptop on the dining room table, open to the screenshot collection I'd assembled upstairs. The truth has a weight that makes lies suddenly seem impossibly light. This is from 3 weeks ago, Helen announced, reading directly from Victoria's Facebook post. So excited to be taking over holiday planning for the family. Time for some fresh energy and new traditions. Michael's fork hit his plate with metallic finality. Taking over? Victoria, you told me Mom asked for help. She did ask for help. Victoria's voice rose defensively. Maybe not directly, but I could see she was struggling. And this one, Helen continued relentlessly, from 2 weeks ago. Looking at beautiful coastal properties with my amazing husband, dreams are becoming reality. She turned the laptop screen toward Michael. That's your mother's neighbor's house, the one that's been for sale since August. Nothing unravels a long-term deception quite like having it read aloud to its intended victims. The silence that followed was different from the earlier discomfort. This was the silence of people processing betrayal, calculating how long they'd been lied to, wondering what else they'd missed. Michael's voice came out hoarse. Victoria, we looked at that house for research. You said you wanted to understand the neighborhood better. I do want to understand the neighborhood better. There's nothing wrong with that. Because you're planning to live here, I said calmly, pulling the house deed from my pocket. According to your text messages, you think Michael is handling paperwork this week to help me transition gracefully. The deed hit the table with authority that seemed to echo through the room. Several relatives craned their necks to read the official document, and I watched understanding dawn on faces around my dining room table. What paperwork, Michael? Uncle Frank's voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who'd spent 40 years in construction contracts and recognized legal maneuvering when he heard it. Michael looked genuinely bewildered. Victoria asked me to research assisted living facilities. She said Mom had expressed interest in exploring options. When? Helen's question cut straight to the lie. When exactly did Barbara express interest in assisted living? Michael's face went very pale as he realized he couldn't answer the question, because the conversation had never happened. Victoria had manufactured my interest in leaving my own home, then convinced my son that researching my displacement was an act of filial care. I never expressed any such interest, I said clearly, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. Victoria decided I was ready for assisted living the same way she decided I was too incompetent to cook Thanksgiving dinner. The catered food suddenly looked different to everyone present, not like generous hospitality, but like evidence of judgment. The professional flower arrangements seemed cold rather than elegant. The entire production felt like what it was: a hostile takeover disguised as helpful assistance. Michael, Aunt Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. Did you know Victoria hired caterers without discussing it with your mother? She said Mom was overwhelmed, Michael began, then stopped as he realized how that sounded to people who knew me well. When has Barbara ever been overwhelmed by cooking? Dave asked incredulously. She's been feeding all of us for 40 years. Last Christmas she cooked for 18 people and made it look easy. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against hardwood floors that David and I had refinished together 20 years ago. I don't have to sit here and be attacked for trying to help. Michael, we're leaving. Sit down, Victoria. Michael's voice carried an authority I hadn't heard since he was a teenager standing up to bullies. We're not leaving until I understand what's been happening here. The house deed lay open on the table between us, David's signature next to mine, the legal proof of ownership that made Victoria's plans impossible. But the real revelation wasn't about property. It was about trust, manipulation, and the woman who'd convinced my son that love required erasing his mother's autonomy. Michael, I said gently, I think it's time you read Victoria's text messages about how easy it's going to be to move me into assisted living so you two can have this house. So why did Victoria suddenly look like someone who'd realized her Operation Retirement Home had just become Operation Exposed Truth? The aftermath of revelation created the kind of silence that follows a storm, when everyone surveys damage and calculates what can be salvaged. Victoria had fled to the bathroom, claiming a sudden headache, while Michael sat staring at the house deed as if it were written in a foreign language he was struggling to translate. 43 years, he said finally, his finger tracing the embossed seal that made our ownership official. You and Dad bought this place when I was negative 14 years old. Negative 14 years old. The phrase made me smile despite everything, a reminder of the mathematical games we'd played when he was learning about time and planning. David had always said we weren't just buying a house, we were buying Michael's childhood and our family's future. Sometimes the strongest foundation you can build is the one that allows others to stand without needing to knock you down. Helen had taken charge of the practical aspects of the gathering, quietly directing relatives to the kitchen where my traditional food waited alongside Victoria's catered alternatives. The comparison was instructive. My sweet potato casserole, still warm and fragrant with cinnamon, versus professionally prepared sweet potatoes that looked elegant but tasted like expensive emptiness. I need to call my lawyer, I said, opening my phone's contact list to find Margaret Walsh's number. If Victoria's been researching assisted living facilities and calling it paperwork, I want to know exactly what documents might exist that I didn't sign. Michael looked stricken. Mom, I would never. I know you wouldn't intentionally hurt me, I interrupted gently, but Victoria has a psychology degree and you have a trusting heart. That's a dangerous combination when someone decides to use professional manipulation techniques on family relationships. The sound of water running upstairs suggested Victoria's strategic retreat was continuing, giving the rest of us time to process the systematic nature of her campaign to displace me from my own life. The most dangerous people are often those who use their professional training to exploit the trust of those who love them. Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who'd been handling family legal matters in coastal Maine for 30 years. "Barbara, dear, how's Thanksgiving going?" "I need you to check something for me," I said, walking into David's old study for privacy. "Has anyone contacted your office about power of attorney documents or property transfers involving my house?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know before Margaret spoke. "Barbara, I received a call yesterday from someone claiming to be your daughter-in-law. She wanted to know about the process for helping an aging relative transition to appropriate housing. I told her that any legal proceedings would require your direct involvement and signature. Yesterday, while I'd been preparing stuffing and setting the table, Victoria had been researching the legal process for removing me from my own home." "Did she identify herself by name?" "Victoria Henderson. She said you'd asked her to research options but were feeling overwhelmed by the legal complexity. I told her that's what family attorneys are for, and that I'd be happy to meet with you directly if you had concerns about your living situation." "Margaret, I never asked Victoria to research anything. I'm not feeling overwhelmed and I have no intention of leaving my home." Another pause, longer this time. "Barbara, I think you need to come in Monday morning. If someone's making legal inquiries about your property without your knowledge, we need to document that immediately." After ending the call, I sat in David's chair, the worn leather recliner where he'd paid bills, planned projects, and worried about Michael's teenage driving, and felt the weight of betrayal settle like November fog. Victoria hadn't just decided I was too old to host Thanksgiving. She'd been building a legal case for my incompetence, using my son's love against both of us to create a narrative that would justify taking my home. The sound of voices from the dining room indicated that family dinner was continuing without me, relatives processing the revelation while Michael grappled with the reality of his wife's manipulation. Helen's voice carried clearly, explaining to Uncle Frank and Aunt Ruth exactly what Operation Retirement Home had entailed. "She's been planning this for months," Helen was saying. "The Facebook posts, the legal research, the systematic undermining of Barbara's confidence in her own capabilities. This wasn't spontaneous concern. This was a campaign." When I returned to the dining room, Michael looked up with eyes that held a heartbreak I recognized from the day we'd told him his father had died. The same shock. The same struggle to reconcile reality with what he'd believed to be true. "How long has she been planning this?" he asked quietly. I set my phone on the table next to the house deed, two pieces of evidence that told the story of betrayal and protection. According to her social media timeline, at least 3 months. According to my lawyer, she was researching legal options yesterday. The house deed caught the late afternoon light streaming through windows David and I had chosen together, illuminating words that proved Victoria's months of planning were built on a foundation that didn't exist. She couldn't take what I'd never offered to give. So why did I feel stronger now than I had in months, sitting in my own dining room with my family finally seeing the truth? The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. While Victoria remained upstairs nursing her convenient headache, the rest of us reclaimed Thanksgiving from the theatrical production she'd orchestrated. Helen quietly moved the catered dishes aside, making space for my traditional foods, and the difference was immediate. Conversation became warmer, laughter more genuine, the gathering more like family and less like a performance. "This stuffing," Dave said, helping himself to a second serving, "is exactly what Thanksgiving is supposed to taste like. Why did we think we needed professional caterers to improve on perfection?" Real authority doesn't need to announce itself. It simply reclaims its space. Michael had been quiet through most of the meal, processing the reality that his wife had been manipulating not just me, but him. Every concern Victoria had voiced about my capabilities, every suggestion about my need for help, every gentle push toward assisted living had been calculated strategy rather than genuine care. "I keep thinking about the conversation we had last month," he said suddenly, addressing me directly for the first time since the revelation. When Victoria suggested you'd be happier in a senior community, she presented it like you'd mentioned being lonely here by yourself. I never mentioned being lonely. The truth hung in the air between us, another piece of Victoria's constructed narrative exposed as fabrication. I told her I was grateful for the space to grieve your father properly. Apparently, she translated that into evidence of isolation, requiring intervention. The distinction mattered. Grief wasn't pathology, and choosing solitude wasn't the same as being incapable of handling responsibility. But Victoria had professional training in reframing emotional states, and she'd used that training to convince my son that my healing process was actually decline requiring management. Sometimes the cruelest manipulation involves convincing someone that love requires them to betray the person they're trying to protect. Uncle Frank cleared his throat with the authority of someone preparing to address the situation directly. Michael, I want you to know that your mother has seemed perfectly capable and content every time we've visited. If Victoria saw signs of decline that the rest of the family missed, I'd be curious to know what training she has that we lack. She has a psychology degree, Michael said defensively, then caught himself. But I guess having credentials doesn't mean using them ethically. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Victoria's return, her descent timed perfectly to interrupt our family processing of her deception. She entered the dining room with renewed composure, her brief retreat having apparently been used to construct a new defensive strategy. I see you've all been having quite a conversation about me, she said, her voice carrying wounded dignity. I hope you realize that everything I've done has been motivated by genuine concern for Barbara's well-being. The statement was perfectly crafted to put the burden of proof on us, to make questioning her motives seem cruel rather than reasonable. But the evidence was already laid out on the table. The house deed she'd never seen, the Facebook posts she couldn't deny, the legal research she'd conducted without my knowledge. Victoria, I said calmly, please explain to my family why you contacted my attorney yesterday to research power of attorney options without mentioning it to me. Her careful composure cracked slightly. I was trying to gather information so I could present you with complete options rather than overwhelming you with legal complexity. By researching how to override my legal autonomy? Power of attorney requires my signature, Victoria. You can't compassion your way around a statute. By researching how to help you make informed decisions about your future. The passion in her voice almost made her sound convincing, but Helen was ready with follow-up questions that revealed the flaws in Victoria's explanation. Why didn't you suggest Barbara contact her own attorney directly? Helen asked. Why did you feel qualified to determine what information she could or couldn't handle? Victoria's answer revealed the fundamental problem with her entire approach. She'd decided I was incapable of managing my own life, then worked backward to create evidence that supported her predetermined conclusion. I have professional training in recognizing when someone needs assistance, but may be resistant to accepting help, she said. Sometimes family members require gentle guidance to see what's in their best interest. And you determined that living in my own home wasn't in my best interest. I determined that you might be happier with less responsibility and more social support. The house deed lay between us like a referendum on everything Victoria had assumed. David's signature, my signature, the date that proved we'd chosen this responsibility together, and I'd maintained it successfully since his death. The room applauded the food. I memorized the lies. Victoria, I said quietly, I want you to pack your things and leave my house. The words carried through my dining room with quiet finality. Not angry, not theatrical, just clear instruction delivered by someone who'd finally understood the full scope of what was being taken from her. Michael started to protest, but I raised my hand gently. This is my home, I continued, and you are not welcome here anymore. Michael is always welcome, but you've demonstrated that you view my autonomy as an obstacle to overcome rather than a right to respect. So why did Victoria look genuinely shocked that there were consequences for systematically planning to steal someone's life? The house settled into evening quiet after the last relatives departed, their goodbyes carrying the weight of witnessing something that would reshape family dynamics forever. Helen had lingered to help clean, but she'd finally driven back to Portland with a container of leftover stuffing and instructions to call if I needed anything. Now it was just Michael, Victoria, and me, 3 people surrounded by the debris of a Thanksgiving that had exposed the fault lines running through our family foundation. "I can't believe you're throwing me out," Victoria said, her voice alternating between wounded disbelief and calculated manipulation. "Everything I did was motivated by love for this family." Love for this family. The phrase sounded hollow in my dining room, where evidence of her deception still lay scattered across the table like pieces of a puzzle that finally made a clear picture. Love that requires lies to sustain itself isn't love at all. It's possession wearing love's costume. "You researched legal ways to remove me from my home without my knowledge," I replied calmly. "You hired caterers to replace my cooking without asking my permission. You convinced my son that I was incompetent to manage responsibilities I've been handling successfully for 40 years. Which part of that was motivated by love?" Michael sat between us, his face carrying the exhaustion of someone whose worldview had been completely restructured in the space of a few hours. The son, who'd trusted his wife's psychological insights more than his own observations, was now forced to recalculate every conversation, every suggestion, every gentle push toward decisions that had felt caring, but now revealed themselves as manipulative. "Victoria," he said finally, "I need you to explain something to me. When you told me Mom was showing signs of decline, what specific behaviors were you referring to?" The question hung in the air with legal precision. Michael had inherited David's methodical nature, and now he was applying it to cross-examining his own marriage. Victoria's pause revealed everything. She'd built her case on general impressions rather than specific incidents, psychological theory rather than observed behavior, professional judgment rather than evidence. "It wasn't any single behavior," she said carefully. "It was a pattern of indicators that suggested she might benefit from additional support." "What indicators?" "Fatigue, occasional forgetfulness, difficulty with complex planning." "Mom planned and executed a perfect Thanksgiving for 12 people last year," Michael interrupted. "She organized Dad's memorial service for 75 attendees. She manages the library's annual book sale that raises $20,000. What complex planning was she having difficulty with?" Sometimes the most devastating cross-examinations come from people who realize they've been used as weapons against those they love. The house deed still lay on the table between us, 40-year-old proof that Victoria's entire campaign had been built on quicksand. She'd spent months planning to acquire property that was never available for acquisition, convinced that her psychological manipulation could overcome legal reality. "I think you should pack your things tonight," I said quietly. "Michael can decide where he wants to live, but my home is no longer available to someone who views my independence as a problem to solve." Victoria's face went through several expressions: shock, calculation, and finally something that looked like genuine distress. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed to realize that actions had consequences that couldn't be psychologied away. "You're breaking up my marriage over a misunderstanding?" she asked, her voice carrying real panic now. "I'm protecting my home from someone who's been planning to take it from me," I corrected. "Your marriage is between you and Michael." Michael looked at both of us with the expression of someone standing at a crossroads he'd never expected to see. His wife of 2 years, the woman he'd believed was helping care for his aging mother. His mother, the woman who'd raised him and clearly needed protection from the person he'd brought into her life. "Victoria," he said slowly, "I need you to help me understand something. When you were researching assisted living facilities? When you were posting on Facebook about taking over from mom? When you were texting your friend about Operation Retirement Home? At what point did you plan to tell me what you were really doing? The question revealed the depth of Michael's betrayal. Victoria hadn't just manipulated me, she'd manipulated him, using his love for both of us to serve her agenda while keeping him ignorant of her actual plans. I was protecting you from having to make difficult decisions about your mother's care, Victoria said, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to someone slow to understand. By making those decisions without my input? By gathering information so you wouldn't have to see her struggle. She wasn't struggling. Michael's voice carried real anger now, directed at the woman who'd convinced him to see weakness where strength existed. You made me think my mother was declining when she was actually doing fine. You used my trust to isolate her from her own family support system. The house deed caught the lamplight as Michael picked it up, studying the signatures and dates that proved his parents had built something Victoria had no right to dismantle. Victoria, he said finally, I think you need to stay somewhere else tonight. The sound of betrayal accepting consequences filled my dining room with the kind of quiet that follows the end of something that can't be repaired. So why did I feel sadness along with relief as Victoria gathered her things from the home she'd never actually been entitled to? 3 months later, my kitchen filled with familiar sounds of preparation as I organized the annual library fundraiser committee meeting. The same granite countertops where Victoria had once dismissed my capabilities now held carefully arranged materials for an event that would raise funds for new children's programs. Michael had filed for divorce in January, a decision that surprised everyone except those who understood that trust, once comprehensively broken, can't be therapyed back to wholeness. He'd moved into a small apartment near the harbor, close enough for Sunday dinners but far enough to rebuild his sense of himself outside Victoria's carefully constructed reality. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is showing them the difference between love and manipulation. The auction raised $43,000, Sarah Chen announced, reviewing the previous fundraiser's numbers. Barbara's organizational skills made it the most successful library event in town history. Organizational skills, the same abilities Victoria had pathologized as evidence of decline, were now being celebrated as community assets. The difference wasn't in my capabilities, it was in the motivation of the people observing them. The house deed had been reframed and now hung in David's old study, not as defensive weapon, but as reminder of what we'd built together and what I'd chosen to protect. Margaret Walsh had updated my will to ensure crystal clarity about my intentions, eliminating any ambiguity that might allow future manipulation. Michael appeared in my kitchen doorway as the committee members gathered their papers, his face carrying the peace of someone who'd chosen difficult truth over comfortable lies. How did the meeting go? He asked, accepting the cup of coffee I'd prepared without being asked, a small ritual that had survived the earthquake of Victoria's exposure. $43,000 raised for children's programming, I reported. Apparently, my declining organizational abilities managed to coordinate the most successful fundraiser in library history. The gentle irony in my voice made him smile, but also carried the weight of lesson learned. Victoria's professional assessment of my capabilities had been so completely wrong that it served as permanent reminder to trust observation over interpretation, evidence over assumption. The strongest foundations are built not from perfection, but from surviving attempts at destruction. I got a job offer today, Michael said, settling into his father's chair at the kitchen table. Elementary school in Camden. Teaching position that comes with summers off to spend with any future grandchildren who might want to learn fishing from their grandmother. Future grandchildren. The phrase carried hope for healing, for family rebuilding itself on more honest foundations than the ones Victoria had tried to erode. Camden's beautiful, I said, close enough for Sunday dinners, Far enough for his independence. Like this house, he agreed, understanding the geography of healthy relationships in ways his marriage had never taught him. Close enough for connection, far enough for autonomy. The winter light filtered through kitchen windows that David and I had chosen together, illuminating the space where I'd raised our son and where he'd learned the difference between love that supports and love that suffocates. Victoria called yesterday, Michael said quietly. She wanted me to know she's engaged to someone from her marketing firm. She said she hopes we can eventually be friends. Eventually be friends. The phrase carried the assumption that time could somehow normalize the systematic betrayal she'd orchestrated. That friendship was possible between people who'd discovered fundamental incompatibility about truth and trust. How do you feel about that? Grateful, he said without hesitation. Grateful that I learned who she really was before she succeeded in convincing me to displace the most important woman in my life. The house settled around us with the contentment of a structure that had survived structural damage and emerged stronger. The same walls that had witnessed Victoria's campaign now held the piece of family rebuilt on clearer foundations. 3 life lessons had emerged from the wreckage of that Thanksgiving. First, trust actions over explanations when someone's help consistently undermines your autonomy. Second, professional credentials don't justify unethical behavior. They make it more dangerous. Third, the strongest love is love that empowers rather than controls, that builds rather than diminishes, that protects rather than possesses. The winter evening embraced my home with the quiet satisfaction of survival. My kitchen, my dining room, my family relationships, all intact despite sustained assault by someone who'd confused manipulation with care. So why did the sound of Michael's laughter over coffee in my kitchen feel like the most beautiful music I'd ever heard? Dignity doesn't clap. It simply stays. The end.